name is Chris McKenzie. I'll be your host for today's session, and I'm joined by the two experts you can see on your screen shortly. Dr. Libby Brooke is the Principal Psychological Health and Safety Specialist at WorkSafe, and her team in the Psychological Health and Safety Unit focuses on prevention of psychological injury in Victorian workplaces. Welcome, Libby.
Thank you.
And Pia Severi is a qualified social worker with experience in the statutory, community and local government sectors. In recent years, Pia worked at the Victorian Trades Hall Council, developing a campaign which included training focused on eradicating gendered violence in the workplace before she moved to WorkSafe, where she now works as a program officer in psychological health and safety programs. Welcome, Pia.
Thanks, Chris.
In the first half of this 45-minute session, we'll cover how work-related gendered violence comes in many forms, all of which are OH&S issues and all of which are unacceptable. We'll learn more about the problem and how to reduce workplace harm, including the developments of effective prevention plans. Then we'll open up for your questions via the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. Feel free to enter your questions anytime from now, so we've got them ready for when it comes to the Q&A. And a note, some of our content today may include material of a sensitive nature that may be triggers for you. If that happens, please feel free to take a break. So let's get straight into it. It's always good to start with a definition to know exactly what we're talking about. So Libby, could I ask you, what is work-related gendered violence, or WRGV as we call it?
Thanks, Chris. So work-related gender violence is any behaviour directed at a person or that affects a person because of their sex, their gender or their sexual orientation, or because they don't adhere to socially prescribed norms. And that can create a risk to someone's health and safety. So this includes violence that's targeted directly at someone because, for example, they're a woman, they're LGBTIQA+, they don't follow socially prescribed norms in the workplace. And it doesn't have to always be directed at them. It could be experienced indirectly as well. So a person may experience gendered violence that's not targeted specifically at them, but they might overhear a conversation that affects them, or they may witness violence directed at someone else. And it's important to note that sexual harassment is a common type of gendered violence as well that we see.
Thanks, Libby. Pia, bringing you in now, how is work-related gendered violence an OH&S hazard?
So OHS hazard because it causes injury to workers, essentially. So under the OHS Act, under the concept of ensuring safety in the workplace, we know that it's incumbent on the duty holder to ensure that workplaces are safe, meaning psychologically safe as well as physically safe. So in that sense, this work-related gendered violence is a hazard that can cause harm, and it can do that psychologically, although physically as well. And that's essentially the core of it.
Thanks, Pia. Back to you now, Libby. How can work-related gendered violence be addressed under OH&S legislation, and what sorts of issues should employers be considering?
Such a good question. I think the most important point is you should consider it the same as you would any physical hazard. So in a workplace, if you have, a trip hazard or a plant guarding issue that you need to deal with to prevent injury in the workplace, you should deal with this in the same way. So following that risk management process. So if we're looking at identifying the hazard, so identify that this could potentially be a challenge or a hazard in your workplace, then doing a risk assessment. So looking at the likelihood of this coming to fruition, of actually eventuating and creating harm to people, and also looking at to what extent it could, the harm that could eventuate from it. Then we look at putting in place controls to prevent it from happening. So you're looking at trying to eliminate it from the workplace if you possibly can, but if not, then you need to reduce it as far as possible under the Act. So when we're looking at reducing it as far as possible, there are some controls that we can put in place in workplaces. And then it's important to review those controls, particularly if anything comes up. So if anyone identifies that there's been an incident or anything like that, it's really important to make sure that you review those controls. And there are some key people in the organisation that should be involved in those discussions, so consultation with your HSRs, so your health and safety representatives, and also, I guess they represent your DWG, but also your health and safety committee meetings that can be discussed there, and really getting that consultation with your staff to understand what's happening for them. And of course, WorkSafe are here if you need assistance. So you can always call our advisory line and speak to one of our advisors about get some advice on what to do in your workplace if you're not quite sure where to go with that.
Great, thanks, Libby. Pia, you've done a lot of work in this specific area over a few different roles. What have you seen that can be the impacts of work-related gendered violence?
Thanks, Chris. The impacts are really significant and long-term often. So we can see there's often cases where workers will end up with anxiety or depression, even suicidal thoughts, or unfortunately sometimes even committing suicide because of the effects of being exposed to this hazard in the workplace. In addition, we know that there's such a close connection between the body and the mind. There's lots of research around this now that demonstrates the ways those prolonged psychological injuries and exposure to psychosocial hazards can really impact the body as well. So in that sense, we see that there's musculoskeletal injuries as well, other forms of injury that can occur through distraction. So being profoundly distracted in the workplace due to dealing with work-related gendered violence can actually lead to physical injury if working in a context in which that might become a problem, like if we're working in a warehouse or some kind of environment where there's other kinds of hazards that we need to pay attention to. And in addition to that, unfortunately, there's also examples where sexual assault and rape occurs in the workplace. And so that's obviously a physical injury, and the outcome there is prolonged and continues psychologically and physically well after the actual incident occurred.
Can you give us some other examples of what exactly work-related gendered violence might look like?
Yeah, sure. So the thing about gendered violence is that we can see some of it as being at this sort of soft end, or the end that's just a joke. It's not a big deal, but actually it is all part of the same thing. And in fact, it sets a scene, creates a context. Some of this what's perceived to be less impactful kinds of behaviours or work systems that might be seen to actually be fairly innocuous, but actually are not innocuous at all. Because as I said, they're setting a scene for some of that more significant or extreme behaviour or incidents to occur. So as an example, we see jokes are really actually very harmful in the workplace. Jokes that are misogynistic or sexist, transphobic, homophobic, all those kind of jokes are just setting the fodder, the feeding ground for more extreme forms of gendered violence to occur. We also see examples like just facilities not being made available to workers. So where there's no proper toilets or change rooms or whatever those facilities are that are required, even not providing uniforms or any kind of workplace system or structure or practice that tends to exclude or suggest that there's some kind of worker that's not welcome in the workplace. So in that sense, women, LGBTIQ workers, or those who don't conform to gender stereotypes may find themselves at being the target of those sorts of workplace systems. In addition to that, then we see the very extreme or overt behaviours. So unfortunately, one of those is sexual assault and rape, which I've already mentioned, sexual harassment, which is part of gendered violence. It doesn't stand alone. And in fact, sexual harassment occurs in a context where gendered violence is allowed to run without being controlled or managed in any kind of way. So you can see it really varies from some behaviours or some systems that are actually subtle and quite hard to pick up, but actually are just as harmful and will lead to significant behaviours and significant injuries if not addressed at that early point.
Have we got recent data that illustrates the problem, and what insights and resources do we have that help inform the issue?
Yeah, thanks. So recently we've had a couple of inquiries really highlight to everyone and really the public as well around the harm that this can cause to people. So we've had the Respect at Work report, the Sexual Harassment Task Force recommendations recently, and as I guess from a perspective of trying to help the public to really understand the issue and to be able to illustrate the issue, WorkSafe developed a media campaign, which was really well received. And we're just going to see a little bit of the video now, and then we'll have a chat about it afterwards.
It can stalk, threaten, and stare. It can hurl abuse at you, or quietly comment on your sexuality.
So gay.
Gendered violence comes in many forms. All are OHS issues. All are unacceptable.
Thanks. So as you can see, I think it really illustrates the fact that these behaviours can be quite subtle and quite difficult to pinpoint, but they still have an effect on people. So such a brilliant marketing campaign, I think, to be able to help people to understand the impact of these behaviours on other people. We've also got our work-related gendered violence guidance on our website. So that's been available since 2020. And we've also developed a one-day health and safety representative, so HSR refresher course, and that's now available and being rolled out to approved providers. So that's great that we have lots of education, lots of resources out there for everyone to be able to understand the impact, but also to understand some things that they can do about it.
Great, thanks, Libby. Pia, are there any misconceptions about work-related gendered violence that you hope to address? And could you maybe articulate some of the perceived challenges or hurdles that some of the audience might be facing in their workplace?
Sure, thanks, Chris. Yeah, definitely there are misconceptions. Some of those would be that gendered violence is just violence and needs to be dealt with as violence in the workplace. So one of the concerns around that is that actually the underpinning reasons that gendered violence occur are broader than just the workplace. It relates to the society and the context that we're sitting in which we have an agenda at the moment around trying to eradicate violence against women, children, LGBTIQ people in the community more broadly. So in fact, the fact that work-related gendered violence enters the workplace is because of those external influences. So we believe that therefore it has to be dealt with separate to workplace violence, which can be caused by different factors. But one of the barriers would be definitely that people perceive it as, well, it's not really any different to that. Others would be that it's not seen as something that's really, that it is seen as a problem, but too difficult to really address. Part of the perception, I think, is around some of those subtler behaviours or systems that I spoke about that people feel are just part of life, part of the job, part of the way things operate, and in fact don't have to be and shouldn't be accepted in a workplace. So there are certain things like jokes or sexual harassment has no place in a workplace ever. There's no time at which that would be reasonable or acceptable, but I think there can tend to be a sense that, well, it's just part of it, not sexual harassment, but the jokes are just part of a bit of fun, or you can't police everything people do. But in fact, we can set standards in workplaces and ensure that there is an expectation around what kind of jokes get told or what kind of humour is shared, because of course we don't want people not to be able to have a laugh at work. It's about being able to ensure that it's safe when we do that. And in the same vein, that those other behaviours like sexual harassment are not treated individually, because that's another misconception that I think occurs. It's just seen as, well, it's a behaviour of one bad apple. If we get rid of the bad apple, then we'll be fine. But actually, the behaviour is the hazard, not the person. And if the person is removed who conducted the behaviour, it means that the setting was already there for the behaviour to occur, and there's no reason to think that the behaviour is not going to re-emerge through other avenues. So in fact, another misconception, I believe, is really people thinking that if we just get rid of the party who's perpetrated the behaviour or initiated the behaviour, that will resolve the issue, instead of looking more systemically at the workplace and really asking ourselves, what's happened here? How did we get to this point that it was perceived by some person or a group of people that these behaviours would be fine to enact in a work setting? So I think those are some of the key misconceptions and barriers I see. Also that sometimes not understanding how OHS could be related to this, when in fact, and I think that's because people can sometimes go to OHS frameworks in that physical, very obvious kinds of hazard risk control, but actually what we're talking about here is psychological and psychosocial hazards that actually can are just as important to control under that legislation that we have, and actually always have been. So there's nothing new in that. It's just that I think sometimes people don't necessarily go to that because it's not as easy to see.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Pia. And as we've heard, work-related gendered violence can have a major impact on employees in the workplace. Without getting too specific, obviously, can you give us some examples and case studies of people who have been subject to work-related gendered violence in the workplace? I'll ask you both. Libby, did you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, unfortunately, we do see work-related gendered violence in the workplace. Sometimes it comes through as bullying. Sometimes it comes through really as, I guess, looking at different types of harassment. If we're looking at sexual harassment, we've had cases in an aged care facility in particular that they were aware that there were behaviours, they'd monitored, that actually documented that there were behaviours that were being perpetrated against one of their employees by a client at the facility. However, that employer then failed to put in place any controls that prevented that risk actually eventuating, and had some serious outcomes for the employee, unfortunately. But I guess it was clear that the employer knew that these behaviours had started to occur, and that they'd failed to actually put in place any controls to prevent that from escalating for that employee, unfortunately. So that's one sad example, but where it could have been prevented, it actually could have, the risk could have been reduced significantly.
And Pia, as we mentioned, you've done a lot of work in this space, so you must have a lot of examples of work-related gendered violence affecting employees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Well, definitely I can think of like hundreds of examples. Some of the key ones that are coming to mind are sharing of like explicit, unwanted kinds of materials in a workplace. And we know now with mobile phones, having our own personal mobile phones in the workplace can sometimes also be one of those areas where we can see that maybe it goes under the radar. So people are showing their colleagues content on their phones that's actually unacceptable to share in a workplace setting. And also is unwanted, hasn't been requested by the other party. I've heard of many examples of that where both men and women have been exposed to that sort of material. And there is a perception that, well, it's that worker's private phone, so it's, bad luck. The employer doesn't have a responsibility there to deal with that, when in fact they do still have there is still an expectation and duty under the Act that in fact all those kinds of behaviours are eliminated ideally from the workplace, so that people are not exposed to that kind of content, because it does cause injury, and it might seem that somebody reacts in a way that doesn't seem as though they're upset. They might just try not to engage, try to laugh it off, try to just avoid that person who might be using that content. But actually the feedback I've heard is that actually it has quite significant impact on people. So there's examples like that, as well as I think in some of those other kinds of settings like nursing or aged care, as Libby's talked about, teaching, which are female-dominated areas of work, in which there's often an expectation that some of the behaviours that the worker is exposed to are seen as part of the job, and they're not part of the job. So it's not part of the job to be treated a certain way, a particular way, because you're a woman. It's not a part of the job to be sexually harassed in the workplace, whether it's by a patient, a family member of the patient, by a student. But sometimes it's neglected to be dealt with because it is seen to be part of the job. So in fact, definitely have heard countless examples there as well of workers having had an exposure to the workplace hazard, but it's been tricky for them to try to navigate how to deal with it, because the perception is that, well, you know, that's what you're doing here. You're a teacher, you have to deal with students and what they say, you have to deal with their family members, but at no time is it acceptable to be exposed to gendered violence in a workplace setting. And there's plenty of ways that that can be controlled, and it can be controlled at a systemic level, not just at that individualistic level that I mentioned earlier. So I think that's really important to take note of as well.
Great. Thanks, Pia. We do have plenty of questions coming through on the chat box. Keep them coming through. If you'd like to punch in a question on the right-hand side of your screen, we'll get to them very shortly. Before we do, I just want to jump in and go back to you, Pia. We always hear that work-related gendered violence includes sexual harassment. How does that fit into WRGV?
How does sexual harassment fit in? Do you mean,
Yeah.
sorry? Yeah, sure. Thanks. That's a really good question, Chris. And I think it's one of those ones that a lot of people are really curious about trying to make more sense of, because it's often seen as that they're quite separate kind of behaviours, and actually that should be dealt with quite separately as well. What I would say is that sexual harassment, and I've alluded to this throughout the talk this morning, sexual harassment occurs in a setting in which it's perceived by the person perpetrating the sexual harassment that they're going to get away with it. Because most of us are not going to conduct ourselves in a way that we think we're going to get in trouble for doing that. So we're only going to behave in a way we think is acceptable because we think that something external to us is sanctioning that. If we've got a workplace setting in which some of those jokes are really loose and fast about women, LGBTIQ people, whatever it might be, we're already pushing the standard down, I suppose, not up. So I see it as kind of like testing. It's like we're in a workplace setting where we're testing what's going to fly, what can we do in this workplace setting, what can we do in this environment. So the jokes go past, nobody makes a comment about it, nobody says, I don't want to hear those kind of jokes. There's nothing coming from a management level to say this is not acceptable in the workplace, but even from peers, because we know that bystander effect is really significant, and there's lots of research that backs that up now as well. So yeah, definitely you got the setting that I think starts to create that. Maybe it's about things like I've already mentioned around expectations about the job. So, you know, it's just part of the job sometimes that you're going to, for example, be a female high school teacher who on yard duty gets talked to a certain way by some of the male students in the yard, which is a common story that we hear. That's still sexual harassment, and it's still unacceptable. That's not just like, well, that's how kids are, that's how boys are, that's how students are. That's not part of the job. So there's those sorts of things where the thresholds are just continually sort of tested, I suppose, tested and checked. And if people get away with it, they'll continue the behaviour. And so sexual harassment to me is just like the kind of one of the outcomes of this kind of cross-section of factors, behaviours, systems, ways of working, cultural norms in a workplace that then says to people, well, this is allowed to happen here. And so somebody then goes and conducts the behaviour. So I think it's really important to remember that the behaviour is the hazard, it's not the person. And also, just as I said earlier, getting rid of that person is not going to solve the problem if all those other things are going on in the background. So we get rid of this person here, but the jokes continue, not pulling up students or patients or family members or whoever it might be, and you know, dealing with those, controlling those risks. If all of that just keeps going, then the void remains, the next person comes in and fills that void. So in that sense, that's the relationship to the way sexual harassment is really a subset of gendered violence, not a standalone hazard.
It's a really good explanation, Pia. Thank you for that. So as we've heard, work-related gendered violence is an OH&S issue that can be addressed in a range of ways, and it must be treated as a hazard, much like any other, and needs to be taken very seriously by employees in every sector and industry. Well, I think it is time to try and answer some of your questions from the Q&A chat box. There is plenty coming through. We'll start with the top question, which is from Anonymous. That's fine. You don't have to put your name to the question. questions if you don't feel like it. We have heard about some of the admin style of controls needed for work-related gendered violence. There is a question here, though, and I'll throw this one to you, Libby. What are some examples of controls that aren't those admin style that employers might want to think about having in place to control work-related gendered violence risks?
Yeah, that's a really good comment. And I think it's really important to look at the entire system. So when we are putting in place controls, looking at the entire system. So that may be different for different industries, but as Pia was talking about before, it can be the cultural aspect. It's really important for leaders to actually role model those behaviours, but also important for them to stand up and actually, if they see anything, they actually have to respond, and they have to put in place controls. They have to follow their own procedures when it comes to it. And I know that that's just one component. And I think it's really important to understand that I think industry has, there are lots of different industry controls that could be industry specific. I'm trying to think of different ones. If we're looking at, for example, we do have quite a few industries that are dominated, sort of male dominated industries. We're having some, you've probably seen on the news from specific areas that there is sexual harassment problems in some industries that they're focusing on. It's really important to understand that this is a cultural aspect. This is something that is more pervasive than just putting in place some training or some, policies and procedures when it comes to how do you report these issues. It is actually entirely the system, and the leaders have such a key role here to play in role modelling those behaviours and making sure that we identify it. Also, enabling other people to feel safe to speak up when it comes to witnessing any events as well. So if you're looking at, if someone actually sees this behaviour happening, as I talked about before, it may not be directly at them. It may be indirect, and they may have experienced it from that perspective. We have to make sure that the workplace feels psychologically safe to be able to speak up when things aren't right, or when they have concerns. So making sure that that cultural issue is targeted, and making sure that those behaviours aren't tolerated, that they are actually, someone will say, actually, that's not appropriate here. This is not what we're going to accept in our workplace.
And I might just follow up on that, Libby, and throw to you, Pia. There's a question here from Sarah, which is in line with what Libby was speaking about there. Have you got any advice, Pia, on calling out inappropriate comments in the workplace?
Sure, that is a really good question. I think in terms of calling out behaviour, I think that it's really important to consider the definition that WorkSafe has in its guidance around gendered violence, which includes, and Libby's talked about this, includes the witnessing of gendered violence, can also mean all that indirect exposure to the hazard can also be just as significant. I think it's really important to think that the calling out is very important, but also to understand that that is because it also affects that person. If we're all working in a workplace together, then something that's happening over there at that corner of the room is still going to have an influence on on the rest of the workplace, the other people in that workplace. And so in that sense, I suppose I would talk about it as it's really important that people talk about the standard they expect in their workplaces, whatever role they hold in the workplace. It's really important, obviously, for leaders to model the good behaviour, but at the same time, it's equally important that everybody at all layers and levels of a workplace feel able, as Libby was saying, to be psychologically safe in a workplace, to be able to just say, that's unacceptable, I don't want to hear it. And not necessarily come in as the saviour, not coming in to say, you shouldn't be doing that to that person, but actually talking about this has an effect on all of us. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to see it. Nobody here wants to hear it or see it, because it's changing that cultural norm, and it's really, I guess, trying to influence that workplace culture to really set a standard and be very explicit about what's acceptable to all members in that workplace, because it does affect all members.
Thanks, Pia. And I might stay with you. We'll go back to the top of the questions now. How do we fight in a workplace the bias of workers that believe women are only promoted to meet the quota, so to speak? How do we challenge that notion in a workplace?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question, and it's a really interesting question. It's harder for me to answer without a bit more context, but I guess I can tell you from my experience in working with, that's a very common form of what I would call resistance to change. It depends on the context. So what I might say might not be that useful for your context, but I would say in some ways, you don't need to engage with the person or the group that's saying that. What you need to do is change the workplace culture. So in my experience, what we're trying to do is there's always going to be people in a workplace who are holding on to ideas that are out of date and have no place in a modern contemporary society or workplace setting, but they still might have influence or power in that workplace, of course. So I think rather than necessarily going head to head on arguments with people in those settings, it's about actually building the agreement amongst the majority in that workplace to really try to influence change and say, well, actually, that's not how we see it. That's not actually true. And we want to have change occurring in this workplace to make it safe and inclusive and not going to cause harm to any worker in this setting. But that might not be, suitable for your workplace setting. It's just a bit hard to know without more context. But definitely what we would always think of it as is really trying to don't expend all your energy just arguing with people who hold views that are very out of date. Try to work on building the agreement amongst the majority in the workplace around what kind of quality environment they want to work in which work-related gendered violence is not accepted, and everybody is aware of that, and it starts to shift that culture.
That's really good advice. Thank you, Pia. Libby, I might throw this one to you. It's a bit of a technical question and another anonymous question. Has the mandatory incident notification scheme requiring employers to report sexual harassment incidents to WorkSafe come into effect as yet?
No. Yeah, so that's a really good question. It hasn't. So that was tied to the proposed psychological regulations. And so currently those have not been enacted. So when it comes to WorkSafe's perspective around reporting, there are still requirements under our Act that exist, and there are certain criteria. So, for example, if someone is sexually harassed and that actually results in them needing medical attention, then WorkSafe does need to know about it. So they need to be notified. So if we're looking at notifiable incidents under our Act, some of the incidents may actually fall under that. So it's important to be aware of that.
And Libby, I'll stay with you now. There's another question here from Ange. How can we help employers understand that gendered violence is just as serious as any other OH&S risk in the workplace?
Yeah, that's a really good question. When it comes to WorkSafe, we've got our campaign out, we've got our guidance material out. There's been media attention to the inquiries. There's a lot of information out there that now we can expect employers to have an understanding that this is an OH&S issue, that this is something that WorkSafe does expect you to look at as a hazard in the workplace and to put in place controls where necessary to reduce that risk to their employees as much as reasonably practicable. So from an employee's perspective, if you are seeing that there are challenges, you can ring WorkSafe. You can speak to your health and safety representative first, initially, obviously. They can look at it and they can see and determine whether or not there is a hazard there that needs to be controlled. And they can bring that to the health and safety committee. They can bring that to the employer. They can have those conversations as well. But yeah, if you need assistance from WorkSafe, our advisory line is there if you need to talk it through.
Great. Thank you, Libby. And just another one. This is an interesting question here, another anonymous question. For employers interacting with the public, so we might be thinking about retail or, as you talked about before, aged care or healthcare even, what can they do to prevent the public's behaviour or actions towards their workers?
That's a great question. To some extent, people can go, oh, there's nothing we can do. Actually, there are lots of things that you can do in this instance, from looking at any, so for example, signs, looking at how people are expected to dress, looking at all those elements in the workplace that I guess an employer has control over, as well as putting in place systems for requiring, I guess, for having escalation if there is a known issue or if there is a potential hazard there. Then making sure that there is supervision, making sure that if workers are particularly vulnerable, that they don't work on their own, that there are systems in place to make sure that an employee cannot be targeted by customers coming in, and that there's no reason that they have systems in place for, I guess, a supervisor talking to a customer, setting behavioural standards and expectations, and having a process in place for rejecting that customer for coming on the premises if that's required.
Thanks, Libby. Pia, I'll throw it to you now. I think we did cover this off at the top of the webinar in terms of our definitions of work-related gendered violence. But a question here is, if we can just go over it again, how do we identify when an incident is gendered violence and harassment?
Yes, also a really good question. And sometimes, as Libby's also mentioned, these incidents or calls might come to advisory as bullying or some other kind of hazard that the person has identified, when in fact it could be actually gendered violence. So I think it's about looking for some of the key aspects or some of the attributes present in whatever it is that's happened. So really trying to identify who's the target, where's the behaviour, or what is the systemic issue, where's it come from? Because either someone's perpetrated it or designed it or thought about the way of working or what it might be. So I think it's about sort of analysing that, as well as potentially looking at if there's repeat incidents in the workplace, maybe towards others of the same group. So if you had numerous women saying that the same kind of behaviour had been directed at them by the same kind of person in the workplace. We know that with sexual harassment, for example, it's predominantly perpetrated by men against women or LGBTIQ people. But so the statistics tell us that. So that's one way to be able to try and identify, well, is this something that's happening, you know, with a pattern or with that kind of the same kinds of people being targeted from the same kinds of people. But at the same time, sometimes it's very subtle. And so again, I think it's about trying to analyse or make an assessment of what it is that's happening in that setting. Is there a gendered element? Were there any kind of slurs or comments made about appearance, stereotypes about who you are based on whoever you are, or was it just bullying, which, you know, might be free of some of those other elements? So it can be quite hard, again, to identify, but it's quite possible to identify. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind. So it's a really good question, because, again, I would say that work-related gendered violence, because it is influenced by the society we're in, and actually, therefore, the strategies need to be dealt with differently than, say, bullying or occupational violence.
Thanks, Pia. Libby, I'll throw it to you. There's a question here about male-dominated industries, such as construction. And if there are workplaces that have a high percentage of males in the workforce, how do we induct them so from the start they're aware of these issues, and we can nip it in the bud from the start?
That's a really, really good question, because when you're looking at you know, people coming into the workplace, setting those behavioural standards up front is really key. Talking about respecting other people, talking about how we do things right now, how we do things in our workplace. This is who we are, and this is how we value our employees. I think it's also important to note that this is an ongoing conversation. So as Pia talked about before, it's then reinforcing that through all these different levels of management have to reinforce it, have to live these values. Everyone in the workplace then lives those values. So yes, you can induct them, you can set those behavioural standards, but then that needs to be reinforced on an ongoing basis.
Can I just jump in and add to that as well? That I think, definitely agree with Libby's points there. I also think it's really important to note that in my experience of working in this field, it's evident that many men experience work-related gendered violence in those kinds of settings as well. And so that can sometimes seem like a bit impossible, or how does that work? But actually, there's lots of behaviours, ways of treating people in those work sites that could be focus on trying to contain or control anyone in the workplace to behave a certain way. So it might be an example that I often wheel out because I've used it recently and used it in training quite a lot is an example of a worker, a male carpenter who was frequently abused with homophobic slurs on a work site because he was a vegetarian. And so there was something about him not being macho enough or manly enough or whatever it might be for that workplace setting. But it's not just him getting the message. His colleagues around him are also getting the message. Apprentices in that work setting are getting the message that you've got to behave a certain way. You've got to be a certain kind of person to fit in this workplace and therefore be safe in this workplace. So I think it's really important to note that when we're talking about settings, whether it's male-dominated or female-dominated, these behaviours or systems can manifest in less obvious ways. So it's not just about women entering that work site or assuming that a female-dominated industry doesn't experience gendered violence, because it will and does in many prolific and unique ways.
Thanks, Pia. As we've mentioned earlier today, WorkSafe does have a campaign out at the moment, and we're asking employers and employees and the wider community to talk about this issue much more. Libby, you're at the forefront of this. Are we seeing an increase in reporting of this issue since our campaign has been out there and since we've been talking about this issue more?
Yeah, it's a good question. We do have, there's definitely more awareness coming in. So we do have more calls coming through that are identifying this. And I mean, previously we did have calls coming through that were coming through as bullying or violence in the workplace that didn't necessarily call it out as gendered violence. But now we are seeing this coming through and being identified from potentially people that may not have been calling through before. So it is really good to see that people are starting to notice that this is a workplace hazard and that it is something that WorkSafe does take seriously.
Excellent, Libby, thank you. And Pia, thank you. We are getting a little bit pressed for time. There are still plenty of your questions, but you can keep them coming through. I think we've done our best to answer a lot of our questions today, and we might just close off with some takeouts from both of you just to make sure that we've covered off everything that we can today. So in closing, Libby and Pia, are there any actions you'd like to see employers change or implement from now? And what do you want them to do with the information that we've given them today in this session? Libby, I'll start with you.
Thanks. I think the most important key message for me is for employers just to realise that work-related gendered violence is an OHS issue. It is a hazard that must be eliminated from workplaces and prevented from occurring where at all possible. It is not something that is impossible to address. You can't just say, well, I can't do anything about it, because you actually can. And it's something that it can't be addressed in isolation. As Pia was talking about, removing one person doesn't actually remove the problem. So it is actually something that you need to look at, the systems of work that you've got, any cultural expectations that people have, and really working with your employees to make sure that this hazard is identified and prevented where at all possible.
Perfect. Thank you, Libby. And Pia?
Well, adding to, obviously I agree with Libby's points. She's made them really articulately and spot on. I think it's also really important to think about what are we prepared to accept? Like, what are we prepared to accept in our workplaces? We know that from a survey that was conducted by the Victorian Trades Hall Council a few years ago, there was almost 20% of women through that survey had identified that they'd left work without telling anyone why, because of exposure to gendered violence in the workplace. So if we think about that as any other kind of hazard, say a physical hazard, would we accept, 20% of a workforce leaving a setting because there's an uncontrolled risk, that you're going to trip or whatever the hazard might be? So I think it's about there's no difference whether it's physical or whether it's psychological, psychosocial. It's really important that we address it, but also that really asking ourselves, what's the quality of the work setting we want to be in? Like, do we want a work setting in which all workers are safe and can go home and be their whole selves when they get home because they haven't been injured at work?
Well, thank you both, Pia and Libby, for your insights today. And we hope that you have found this an interesting and informative session. This webinar will be available online via WorkSafe's website next month, so you can view it at any time. We're also interested to hear about your experiences and feedback of this WorkSafe Health and Safety Month sessions and the overall event this year. So please look out for an email. We'll send you with a quick survey. And as a thank you for completing the survey, you can go into the draw to win one of 5 $100 gift cards. Winners will be notified in November. We'll note on the screen shortly the contacts that we have talked about today that you might find helpful if you're facing work-related gendered violence as an employer or an employee. And if you have any requests for further information, we recommend you get in touch. And remember, if there is something you want to discuss urgently when you're at work, please contact the WorkSafe advisory line. And don't forget, the emergency line is open 24/7. Thanks for watching.